나 그 생각도 저 동화래 제가 동화 미디어 봐서 동화래 타고 고해서 동화래 타르지에는 저기 탈바다 탐지기 몇 거 토발 제발라 나는 저기 람냠네 제고 고래제로 다 람냠는 제디 가르스는 람냠는 제 나네다 람 초도 교바디 태바침비기 취냠는 제들이서 자다 태바침비 취냠는 제발라양 내 냠는 제기 띠 태바침 고고래서 지산띠 다띠 밀르름 버치해야지 아니 다와게다 저와 주상위게 다 된주기 밀르름 버치 고고래서 지산 되네게 된주기 밀르름 버치 토비알라 아니 지게 저기 근데 유마사바 토야메로 지산 되네기 띠 야고치 토발라 인규 야고 싸고 그래 지산 되네 인장 저기 된주기 밀르름 버치 토베체도 인규 마상와메 발라 라고 그래야지 아니 규 마상와 라고 그래서 그 마상와메 발라 그래서 규디 가래 람나 저기다 룽아이스 니제디 추림소야디다 밀르름 버지 토픽이 규체 아니 짐베냠는지야 쇠베냠는지야 준주냠는지야 아니 몰람 답이야디 저기 어도스네 제 오래스 인사디 당아 저기 대사바 달려 대주 밀르름 버지 토픽이다 규조어디 차고래 디송한테 장고 냠는 제고래지 당한 제 대래 이내야 당한 저기 개왕아만의 40빌리 량한 비티르 몽부 여바나 안데네기 디립티기에다 자산다 님보도 쉬고네마 샤고래스 마샤바이나 당한 냠는 제알이야 안 파시지고 지산 도 샤고래스 온도시네 그니 디고랑 아주 데네 쉬르와다
Good morning. Last time we spoke about how all of us are the same in having a deep innate desire to be freed from all suffering and misery. And in order to achieve a state freed or liberated from suffering, we need to develop mental paths. And in order to be able to gain these realizations, develop these mental paths, we have to have a suitable basis for practice. And the best of bases is that of a precious human rebirth. So we spoke a bit about that last time, as well as that the attainment of a precious human rebirth is not only difficult and rare, but it is so because it comes about in dependence on the accumulation of specific causes. And these 5 causes we need to ensure, as at a minimum, we train in, so that we can have good rebirth after good rebirth. And these 5 causes are ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, and prayer. So it's imperative that we accumulate these complete causes, because it's not to have a precious rebirth, precious human rebirth. All 5 of these need to be accumulated. And in addition to the accumulation of these causes, on our continuum are a vast store of karmic imprints from negative deeds we've done. And these hinder our spiritual development. Therefore, it's imperative that in conjunction with accumulation of virtue, we purify our previous accumulation of non-virtue. And this is done through the skillful method of the application of the 4 opponent powers.
개회신이 구성 투숨 유인된 제비토네 안에 개회신이래 대바자야 대바자야래 안에 개회신이라 안에 그린지스트 그린지ren자다 그러면 개회신에서 마세 그린지 뭐 소소 둥알에 타야다 디기 주야게 탑람 땡겐데 당원에 개회신이래 제사다 소소 파마로시니 파마디게 세디기 롭정 잠다 안 세딜에 소소기 안에 도고 주야 디기 주야 파미겔 도스 판도지고레스 이 개와치마다 타바 탐지킴고 봐 토야디다 밤에게 지도고 말아와 지난 기회신에서 되겠다 Kewa Dimasi, Sedele Digi, Kewa Chimada, Tarvada Tamji Kimiko, to a lambding at the Givation is, San Givation Pemas, Gedin Chimburi, a Gedin Jayada. And then Gedi in a Givation Elia, and the Chike. Ankarfori Kyun Dayada, the nigger somebody can thank me, and begin this some down come here, give you come to the chair. And then Dijela, Angazuge, Dirwa, just not then you million much bear, Masiki, Kasore, Angazu top cover, said, Angazu that it, then then you million much top to your, just that it's Archimoshure, then tell Yangazuki, give in Yamne. You to be a Dunga say, I get it, two waters, just not any thought, but must such buins. They are that didn't tell ya, and a giddy Yamlea was Majabana, the giddy cheetah, giddy Mavachang, never your mares, and the Mitaba, then you believe much Zachimogoviada, then the Mitaba, Kijiki, Mitaba, some died the community, Nibati Cherua, then the Sumba della, and then Azuke, the Dunga Sungu Dunga della Tarwood was some diada, the late Jopigeda, Nibati Sulio, kept your conscious like yours, conscious like Ichiche. Then, and that was Dunga Tada, conscious, kept your conscious Muguri, same big conscious like Ichiche, and the Cambridge the chair. The Sumba the chair, that Shiba della that another day, Chesa that Angazuke, Tam, Deniki, that Tapachimbuki, Chunyaman, Yabucheba, Dima, some that, during that Angazuku come Yamlejo. That dance on top to about the Zachimatilia and Yamleche, Mon Bainea, Tanzo Yamleche, Tia was Matobaina, and Yawachima, Mason, Kesson by Nadine, and then Che Tabachim Yamleche, Ragama, Deza, dance on Tobe Childu, and Setelia, so in Yamleche, and the Jigit, the got the Jimba to Suris over Junius and the Gas Jimba to Sutimda, and the Servata Junduida, Dine, and the Garsuri, Molam Diatige. Ya wachi kuti di nyamne jigin sembe dus chene nga zu sam ta je nyamne je rimbadi kisingi shedi da nya dus chagorwa.
And last time, prior to looking at Precious Human Rebirth, we looked at the indispensable role that relying on a spiritual teacher plays. We looked at how to rely on a spiritual teacher, and this is to generate a strong trust and conviction in him, so as to open ourselves up to the advice that he imparts in teachings, and thereby to have the strength of mind to cultivate that advice within us, to meditate and reflect on that advice. One generates a strong trust and conviction in our spiritual teacher through three aspects. Firstly, reflecting on his great qualities, his qualities of his body, speech, and mind. Secondly, reflecting on his tremendous kindness. In terms of reflecting on the teacher's kindness, we can also should be aware that many beings, such as our parents, have been kind to us in this life. But they only help us, whilst in crucial ways, just in regards to comfort of this life. Our spiritual teacher helps us to gain the wisdom to recognize what our actual situation is in cyclic existence and how to gain freedom from that. And through his skillful teachings, he guides us in a way specific to our own individual personalities. So therefore, the kindness that our teacher shows us is a kindness that we experience in this life through our mental development and our lessening of suffering experiences, as well as through our spiritual progression. We benefit from lifetime to lifetime, all in dependence on the kindness of our teacher. So that's the second aspect of the meditation. And the third is to ensure that whenever we recall our teacher, we call him to mind, we only recall his good qualities. And should we observe any faults, immediately transform our way of perceiving that. Use that as an opportunity to develop the skillful means to focus on his qualities and to take any perceived faults, rather as an opportunity for us to purify those same faults within ourselves. So that's in brief what we looked at last week, but there was somewhat more between. So the meditation that we covered in the last two sessions was that of the practices that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So here the reflection, after reflecting on the qualities of the teacher, goes on to the precious human rebirth. And once one has reflected on this incredible precious human rebirth, one goes to the second practice of that is shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, and that is impermanence, where we reflect that this incomparable opportunity that we've achieved is impermanent. It will end. It will end, and at the time of it ending is completely unknown. It could just be a breath away. It could be a few weeks away, a few years away. We have no way of knowing with certainty. So therefore, we mustn't waste a moment. And this is, as we heard last week, a crucial meditation to give strength to mind, to endeavor in our meditations. Then the third meditation, following precious human rebirth and the impermanence of this life, is that of refuge. Who has the ability to skillfully guide us in our spiritual development? That is the three jewels. And here we open ourselves up to that guidance so that we can take responsibility for our spiritual development and our inner transformation through relying on the three jewels. And then the fourth aspect we looked at was that now, having recognized this incredible opportunity that I myself have achieved through the accumulation in past lives of the causes that have ripened in this life, but that these causes that this result is changing momentarily and therefore is not stable, but I have encountered the three jewels, and I have a reliable refuge, so I must make use of this. We come to the fourth point. Here we train in these the meditations that were mentioned previously. The fourth step of the meditation is to train our minds in ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, and then lastly prayer.
Adi kizin di she ding an zoge ande ki wo chungu lam yi rin ba lo chang tha di lo chang do dus chen sam na ta gom bi rin ba do sus gom go re se che ki wo chungu lam yi rin ba lo chang tha di she ba ro da de rin ma she di da ki wo chungu lam yi lo chang sa ne da de ne ani ki wo ding gi lam yi ba lo chang go re de di ko ma shu ya de.
So last weekend then, in those two sessions, we looked at the meditations that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity, and that's what I've just recapped now. Today, we come to look at the practices that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity.
And that is a degree best and Dunga Meva Rebes, the Milia Kina, Midal Halia Kina, Dunga Meva Rebes, the Amares, Tanga to think, Chisanega Mansong, Dunga Tower Mado, Dunga Tario Mares, just a Milina, Dunga Mongoyer, Halina, Dunga Mongoyer, Chesatineza, Dunga Tario Mares. Tankashi or another Dunga Tower is, Dunga Tower, Dunga Nem. Namya Gune Zawa Gune Dunga Meva Go Res and the Digo Res, that the Ganesh, that Digoyala, and the Ganes Yaman Ganechore, said Ma, this the Digor shared.
The trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity starts with the honest recollection that whilst this attainment of a rebirth as a human is crucial and is welcome, we have only very temporarily closed the door to a rebirth in the lower realms. We've only very temporarily gained freedom from rebirth in the suffering lower realms. Because when this life ends, which could be at any moment, we could still be born there. So that we have only closed the birth to rebirth for this in the lower realms for this one life. Moreover, we know that rebirth in the upper realms that of a human or as a god are still pervaded by suffering. We know we experience suffering. We are still bound in suffering. So therefore, whilst what we have achieved, this precious human rebirth, is crucial and welcome, we haven't yet attained lasting, stable freedom from suffering, which is what we desire.
That's it. Do the Nimi Samla Mabena, Tarba Dunya Jijin Mikishing, Kunjung Kori Juri Masamna, Kore Zawachi Sumishibe, Siling Eju, Geshe Tembada, Kowa Gangi, Jingba Sheba, Jizun, Najulamium and the Terze, Tardu in Kansalo Sashi.
This then brings us to verses 19 and 20. If you do not strive in contemplating the faults of samsara, true sufferings, genuine aspiration for liberation will not arise. If you do not contemplate the sequence for remaining in samsara, true origins, you will not understand how to cut the root of cyclic existence. So it is vital to rely on disenchantment to renounce samsara and to know which factors chain us in cyclic existence. I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire for liberation should do likewise.
Tanganzo deji kiwo chungi lami rimba kabla nyamle chidu kabla zo ngasong dunga la tar gudu sempige samloti di tho che ngasong dunga la tar che ne la dami mondio ko ba tho gudu sempige samlo unno la basona ngasong dunga la tar du ge sambake dele thane la da mondio ko ba tho gudu sempige sam ta di kiwo chungi lami bu kunlos di jwa di je ne nyamle kar ji wosen jemba tsuchim soba zunju ane nyame molam jaare zo dire andigala ne shera kasa samden da shera nyamle china yungu tigor ina zo dire wa odu sere shegore da dikapso karasene da kunlo de karasene chisa da masung dunga le thadel hada mi ko ba thoba ine ya chisa dunga ra shi dunga dile tha gudu chisa dunga thada le tharbe tharba se thogudu sebe tharba donye yi samlo di ko gore chisa tharba thogudu sebe tharba donye yi samlo che digi thone da nyamle je di jimbe nyamle je sebe nyamle je zunre nyamle je samden di shera nyamle je da kibu dingel lamge ribe nyamle kapla da jimba churin soba zunre di nyamle je da digala ne samden da shera ge nyamle di ane Geshe Rabten odu chene nyamle je di dire kunlo de dunga 타달레 terbe tarba togudu sembege tarba donyi sambashke tarba donyi sambake bi thone da ngandu jimba da nyime suri nyamleja sebe nyamleja zunre nyamleja samde nyamleja ni shera nyamleja direda.
Here we crossed over from the practices shared with a practitioner of initial capacity to the meditations shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So let's compare these two in terms of motivation, goal, and the practices or the trainings that they engage in. So the practitioner of initial capacity has as their goal a good rebirth in the upper realms, that of a rebirth as a human or a god. And the second part of their motivation is to attain freedom from rebirth in the lower realms, but a temporary freedom, a freedom just for a single rebirth from being reborn in the lower realms. So those are their two aspects of their motivation. A temporary freedom from rebirth in the lower realms and rebirth as a human or god. The motivation of a practitioner of intermediate capacity is far vaster than that, because they've come to recognize that even rebirth in the higher realms as a human or god is still pervaded by suffering, and there remains a danger of falling to the lower realms. So their motivation is to gain liberation from suffering in its entirety, and thereby attaining lasting, stable happiness. Happiness that is not punctuated by a moment of suffering. So here are these two practitioners, their goals are very different. The first is striving for a temporary happiness of a rebirth in a higher realm, and temporarily closing rebirth to the lower realms. The practitioner of intermediate capacity, though, is striving for complete liberation from suffering and lasting, stable happiness of liberation. It's a far bigger goal. And then their practices that they engage in So the practitioner of initial capacity is training primarily in ethical restraint, generosity, patience, choice, perseverance. So these are the primary practices. They may supplement their trainings with some concentration and wisdom, but those four are primary. The practitioner of intermediate capacity trains in those four: ethical restraint, generosity, patience, choice, perseverance, but also explicitly trains in concentration and wisdom. Concentration and wisdom are crucial to be trained in on the basis of the preceding four. So that is the key difference in terms of their training.
대주 밀르머체 한저기 주름 야보 송 진배 냠래 야보체 수배 냠렌제 되는 전주 좀 안델이야 몰람 야보 잡아이나 아니 대주 밀르머체 덮투고 그래 근데 진에다 라도 먹은 바이나야 덮투고 그래 나 탈바토발라 나 진바던 수준 수보 전주 아니 삼된 냠는 제바 제네 가서 진바도 수준 수보 전주 냠내제 몰람 잡 아니 삼단의 시력 냠는 마시나 타바도 두고 말해. 제가 진바단 수림 쇠바 전주 삼단 냠는 삼단 전주 냠는지 디강라 아니 nem바 타바도라 가르쳐 고라서는 딩이지 신의 줍 아니 신의 딩 안에 동반이를 미비게 신의 줍 동반이를 미비게 라동 줍 딩이디 곰 제는 타바도 고거래. 제가 타바토야라 진보 수준 쇠바 전주 디 인지미 고래다. 딩이디 대다 안에 디가라 셰랍당 안에 신내다 라도니 곰제 디다 주가 상고고래 디 주차제는 냠내 제발에 되는 타바도 고고래.
So what's just been said, I hope it's clear the different motivation and goal, as well as trainings that the practitioners of initial and intermediate capacity train in. So the reason for this difference is that in order to achieve the desired goal of the practitioner of initial capacity, that of a precious human rebirth, or rebirth as a god, it is sufficient to train in ethical restraint, patience, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. There is no need to achieve that goal to also train in concentration and wisdom, though of course it's good to do so. But there is no need to train in concentration and wisdom. However, for a practitioner of intermediate capacity, striving for the goal of complete freedom, they have to train in the union of calm abiding and meditative insight and wisdom. It's indispensable. And they have to train in these two trainings, concentration and wisdom, in conjunction with the four trainings that the practitioner of initial capacity also trains in, those of ethical restraint, and generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. So the practitioner who's striving for liberation has to train in those same four as a practitioner who's striving just for a good rebirth, but they also have to train in concentration and wisdom. These two trainings are indispensable for the achievement of their goal.
tarpa dunye ges tarpa sedi nyomo bangazo kowala ke nyomo ba sabona jeba pangbe pangba di tarpa se gore chesan di togudu sambe dunye samlo shi ko kureje di dunye ge samlo yala ane dangbo garis nyamne je gore lana a zu koyi le gyön tong gore kowala gyön da goreje benedelia dudi nyimi samla mabena so chesan dukdelya nyimi taje denegi besoje no gom고 goreje 다 두들에 님에다시도 당하도 계신 제가 충일 남이네 바샤바는 냐와 이다 안 두르게나 둥아 빠도면 되는 용도와 선배기 제바차 삼다 안디나신 다 두삼단다 냐와다 난손레 타제다 밀게바네 둥아 요마르스네 다 밀레 둥아도 미카셸이야 아니 지게 사야도야 강아 차베 둥아 또베 조도베 둥아 네나세게 둥아 소수게 되바 머르베 둥아 안 소수게 지게 예대된 대단 자유의 동화 소수게 되니게 자유의 동화 당하들야 미 교부이나다 미 첨부이나다 미 깨다 첨부 차상이야 누가이 라신지 레샤 선배게 되니게 삼다다 되니게 할이네 누가 봐도 매 봐요 제사다 내가 녀모 코와라 그스키나 누가이 라신 레샤 선배도 신 제바지 누가 삼다도 제사 제바지 삼다도 때 누가 들레다 탈고도 선배게 삼도데 리기리 해제래 제사 누가 삼마다 만나 누가라 탈도가 삼바기가 말했어 제사 되니자 누가라 탈고도 누가라 탈배 타바 토고도 선배 삼 야고시와라 제사 되스네 누가기랴 두디 누가랴 삼다 제바지 두친 공고를 해지 두지 님이 삼라 배고 그래서 마배바이나 네 타바등에 삼바기로 말했어 제사 당보 두디엘랴 코르위 누가랴 안 누가게 삼다제 gyön samda, dusin samda, jeba che gore jere.
The practitioner of intermediate capacity, they have as their objective to achieve a state completely liberated or freed from suffering, a state freed from cyclic existence. So what is what marks the attainment of liberation? It's the complete abandonment of all the afflicted minds together with their seeds. When those are abandoned, there can be no more ripening of afflictions because they have been abandoned together with their seeds. Therefore, there can be no further experience of suffering. That is the state of liberation. One is liberated from suffering. In that, one will never suffer again because the causes of suffering, the afflictions together with the seeds, are completely eradicated. So that is the objective, the attainment of that state. How to do so? Well, the first line of verse 19 indicates the starting point of the meditation. If you do not strive in contemplating the faults of samsara, this is crucial. This is crucial. So the practitioner who's reached this point in their training has already meditated well on the faults of the lower realms and has developed a determination never to be born there, to do all they can to ensure they don't fall into the lower realms. Here now, they're coming to look with vivid clarity at their situation as a human being, as well as the situation of gods, coming to understand that there is no rebirth anywhere within cyclic existence, not even in the upper realms, where happiness is experienced, where there is a lasting respite from suffering. In fact, there isn't even a temporary respite from suffering. Sometimes suffering is more intense, sometimes less, but one always suffers, and this needs to be realized in a transformative manner. So here, the practitioner starts out by meditating on the faults of the human experience and then the God experience, reflecting on the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness and death, reflecting on the sufferings. So there we would include, for example, the sufferings in the world from the pandemic at the moment, the sufferings from hunger and thirst that we see in so many places, as well as, and here we look at our own suffering experiences as well as what we observe in our community and what we observe through the media. And we also then go to subtler levels, primarily looking at the mental level. For example, the suffering of meeting the unwanted. This is a tremendous suffering for beings. And a companion to this, the suffering of being separated from the wanted. These two torment beings so. And a third one here is the suffering of not getting what one desires despite striving for it. These we need to look at and look at in detail, because without reflecting well on the faults of samsara, we will continue to long for happiness that is bound within samsara, happiness that is deceptive in its nature because it is actually suffering, and thereby we will not have the strength of mind to apply ourselves to the trainings. So this is the starting point.
Then social sometime the social in the society dunga Gabriela and China say one dunga and it Gabriel social digisi on bene lamsa de pa gyushin dunga wo gyuya. Jisa de dunga the dunga dash shan me chasan le yore chesa sosli ne dunga yu dunga chesa da denege dunga ya da yu dunga ya da karchin yungorsin sosu yu phumbo de yo ba phumbo de la tene da yu dunga le gora dunga yung chesa da nganju phumbo di 다 yu dunga da dunga yo chasan dengi shize de dendi ne roz ma sona nga phumbo re sha chesa phumbo di dunga ye rashi re se de kyawa di ju gi dunga wo so ko chowa dunga da de me ne dunga yu dunga da yu dunga yo chasan phumbo de la den de gor chesa dene za nga phumbo dia ando sin de yu kyawa di ju dunga re se de chesa nga ju gi so so ran la dene ge nye le nga zo nya wa da yi da dun ro da dene chasa yu sam da dene sam da so so ran sam da so so ran da so so dunga yu dunga so so lu bo de kyawa di dunga re chesa da nga ran ge dene za nga ju ko wa le ki bi da nya wa yi da dun ro mi sa da ka de shi ne chik pa re se dunga ya yu dunga yo ra kyawa di dunga den kyawa di dunga le sha se be do che ne a go me di da dene sam da yu dene ka li ge se ne 지사 타바 되니 지신 미기에서 근데 삼마다 와있나 타바 토부도 세별로디 약고시키 두 말해라 데네게 삼마다지 동하게 라시 레샤 세비게 괜시 통어도 데네 타바스 마탐데 타베델레 타바 토부도 세베 타바 되니 삼바디 기도 그래서 지사 타바 되니로 깨해야 누치는 장고를 삼나 거의 동하 괜다고 그래 괜지 삼당 그래지래
The starting point here is to reflect on the faults of cyclic existence in its entirety, to come to see in a transformative manner that there is no rebirth or even experience to long for, believing it will bring us happiness, lasting happiness or even temporary happiness. We need to understand that there is nothing worthy in cyclic existence of longing for, of striving for. Only thing worthy of striving for is liberation. But to get to see that, we have to first overcome this veil of deception that leaves us in the state of darkness, thinking that there is pleasure in cyclic existence. There are experiences to long for. There are experiences to strive for in cyclic existence or rebirths, where happiness is experienced, where we look at what others have with jealousy, with envy, and with desire to achieve it ourselves, thinking happiness will come. This is what we need to overcome. And to do so, the meditation on the faults of samsara is crucial. It's indispensable. So there's different ways. There's the eightfold division, the sixfold division, and the threefold division. Ideally, all need to be reflected on. But it comes down in the clear division, the clear threefold division, where we reflect on the suffering. Firstly, the suffering of physical and mental pain. Physical pain, we all know. Mental pain, we don't always recognize as suffering. What it comes down to is every coarse or even mildly rough affliction that arises is suffering. Attachment, when it arises, is suffering. Not just anger and jealousy, all of them. Pride is suffering. This is the first of the threefold division, the suffering of physical and mental pain. The second is the suffering of transient happiness, where we reflect that every happy experience that we have experienced thus far in cyclic existence, it has ended. It ends, and it leaves us longing for more. So immediately it is followed by suffering. And when we look in more detail at the suffering of transient happiness, we see in its very nature, it is suffering. It is not happiness in its very nature. The third then of the threefold division, that was the second. The third is that of all-pervasive suffering. And this is that our very physical and mental aggregates are the basis of suffering, are pervaded by suffering. The entire cyclic existence is pervaded by suffering. As long as we have these contaminated physical and mental aggregates, or it's also called the suffering physical and mental aggregates, or it's called the appropriated physical and mental aggregates, we have the basis for suffering and we will suffer. And this is the truth of our situation. And it is the truth of the situation of every other human being and God. So this is the crucial meditation that we have to meditate on. And if we do not do so, we see the second line in verse 19, genuine aspiration for liberation will not arise. We will not give rise to a wish that is uncontrived, a determination to transform our life. So therefore, this first meditation is imperative.
안도 신앙이 동아 삼마다 바이나 동아 인에서 하고 말해 세상 되네서 동아데 되네 두스네 아주 삼마다 제바체 삼당고래 두수세도 되네 신 동아 용도 되네 용도 왔으면 두스네 삼단베네 동아디 바 모트그레스 제가 삼마다만 동아 모신 말했어 제가 동아 모트여도 하고여도 다 동아들에 탈고도 삼비가 삼마도 탈바동이 기기리 해제래 나디네 삼단에 단 타바동일로 깨와 삼이 안 디고르베는 디고 말했어. 다디니바데 삼 갈당 거랬으네. 제자다 동아디 요해디 저 매와 소고 타고도 매와 소고 다 간에 소고래 매봐. 동아 요해디 간에 용구래 유간에 때 용구래 했으면 야 동아 요해기 귤이야 잡아져 그래 제. 제자 동아기 요난기 귤이 파 잡아지디 되는 동아 귤이 하고 그래서 옆에네 텔레 칙텔레도 군중 코웨 주림 마삼나 코웨 자와치수 미시베스 제가 동아 여행에 규디 가르에서네 가르치 공부도 제바체도 동아 연주 아니 군중 사야돼 레다 녀모 발때 리도 세베 하고 두고레스 레다 녀모 바 제가 군중 코웨 주림데 레다 레 녀모 원게 레사 레예 원게 되는 아주 냐 까브레 슈쳔보에네 냐와다 기아다 둔들기야 델레드스라 다가인데 미기야다 할기야 된 레지왕의 와서 수부디레 나자다야다 레지왕 수부디 레지왕의 기와서다 곧 캬바디 동아 차로 그래 안 되네든 리도와 제자데 레지왕의 기도 세도 제도 너 동아의 규디 레다 녀모비 자고 그래지 다 레다 녀모바 나네 디나데 쪼어디 가르샤서 제바체도 그 녀모바래 가서 레사에 대해서 녀모바 기에신 레사글 마도 녀모마 기나 레사글 말해. 진짜 녀모바 때네 기도서. 다 녀모바 나래 되자 요라 콘도 요라 나자 요라 말이 봐. 대수 세상 간에 리도 두 제바체도 되는 녀모바네 쪼나 세베나 라신 유튜브 짐바 나 다도 주바지면 다신들 리고래지. 진짜 니네 간에 리도라도 나봉아주 콘도 기도 간에 스키도라네. 나 세데 기에신네. 오, 나 세게데 나래 코뉴도 쓰는 나래 견지지도 쓰는 되는 아주 파고서 거라 당보 나 삼네 코고를 미지기 찍찍을 아주 두자 라바나 당보 나 삼 거지 야 나래 코디라기도 와 삼베 삼제데 되는 거 파고란 거래서 진짜 코르기야 돼 당보 나진디기 되는 되는 코르기 거래 다 되셔 삼다베네 아주 잘라질래 차바기베네 당보 나 세 삼다 오 나고 디야고든 딩할 고고도 셈비게 되는 할래 고고 셈비 된 잘라들 되비게 차바차바게 하나 다 나제 제베네 다뭐 나 세게 나 스슴다데 나 콜레야래 나게라 시기래 나연데 체레서 나게 기기래 그래서 두신 되셔 공도 나게 요모바카데 기나 쪼나 세베 나 라신 두베 짐베지 델레든 레용도 와서 제사다 요모바 찾아 요석에 자와디 나 세번 나 라신 주바지면 나 다도 주바지면 다 진짜샤서 저선 디 델라데네 아니 되샤게 되샤 왕기 아니 심체 소초체 레사 데네 레사 데네 디기데네 나서를 깨와링기도 세하다 저선 나 세비기데 콘로기 콘로 왕게 샬라 녀바기 디 레사 데네 나서를 깨하다 깨 디레샤 저선 데네기 아주 밀리 깨베네 다로 왔네 나 세디 나진기 정하 아니 코발렛 가소리 나솔라 타고 된장아 나 아니지 수진 마손나데 디기면서 배 나진 기에서 나 수준사 디레티사 디레 야고 개와 개벨 디기네 밀리 개와레 마디 용도 와서 된사 아주 동화대 동화 요야 유조데 레다 녀모바 레게 나네 디 규딜 녀모바 녀모바는 소 다세 마리 바레샤 세네 두스제바치도 다세 마리 바자 하고 그래서 데네 하고요도 다 나진 마리바데 빵고르간 스빵고레서 제바체 빵타데레 하고 두고레서 제가 데네 자 누가 유 가르기도 제일 제바 맞제 봐나 레다 녀모 하고 두고 말해 녀모 봐 먹었나 녀모 빵다신 말해 제가 되는자 아주 군중에 규안은 가서 군중이야 삼당을 빼마스 계침벌에 당버스 단이버들 삼나 디당고래서 군중 거기 주림 마스나 거기 자와지서 시기 말해서 제가 군중의 동아대 뭐 군중의 삼당 디규 녀모 방어서도 되네 바제바제제 디파야 그림바디 하고 두고 해제래.
First meditation, which is on the truth of suffering, is crucial. This is the basis for development of the practitioner of intermediate capacity. Here, they focus in their meditations on suffering and the various aspects coming to a subtler and subtler understanding. And as with all a meditation, then in between meditation sessions, as they're going about their daily life, they keep in mind, using mindfulness and introspection, they keep in mind the topic of meditation, seeing how suffering follows suffering, particularly on the mental basis, how one then needs to keep desiring happiness where happiness cannot be found. This is crucial because this leads to the wish to be freed from the state, becoming disenchanted with this, becoming exhausted with this circle of pain. Then, in dependence on this, comes about the thought, what I'm experiencing, the suffering I'm experiencing is a result. All results come from causes. I need to identify these causes well, because when the causes are identified, they can be eliminated. And when a cause is eliminated, the result will never be experienced. And this result, I don't want to experience a moment longer. So in dependence on the strength of this determination not to experience the result, which is suffering, for a moment longer, the causes are sought in order to come to eliminate them. And this then brings us to the third line in verse 19. If you do not contemplate the sequence for remaining in samsara, what is the sequence of samsara? These are the causes. Firstly, it's karma that leads to the ripening of contaminated karma that we ourselves have accumulated. That creates our samsara. It's this ripening of karmic seed after karmic seed that creates our samsara. So these karmic seeds are the cause of our suffering. These karmic seeds, though, whilst being the cause of our suffering, they, being a cause, are also a result in that they were caused. So here we dig a little deeper. What is the cause of our contaminated karma? It is the afflicted minds, our own afflictions. Our own afflictions are the cause that leads to the result of our accumulation of contaminated karma, which ripens in our myriad suffering experiences. The cause of our contaminated karma, these afflicted minds, they are numerous. There's anger, there's jealousy, there's attachment, there's pride, and so forth. Whilst these are the causes for the accumulation of our contaminated karma, these afflictions themselves are a result in that they come from their own root cause. That root cause is the ignorance of self-grasping. The ignorance of self-grasping is the cause from which all the afflictions arise. And from the afflictions, we accumulate contaminated karma and our suffering experiences. So how does this ignorance of self-grasping act then as the cause of all the afflictions? It's believing that the self exists in a way that it does not. That we, through this ignorance, this mistaken belief, this wrong belief, comes all our attachment. I want. This I wants this I wants that. Moreover, all our anger comes. This I needs to be protected. It does not want that. It doesn't want to be around this person. It doesn't want to be around that event. But it does want to be around this person. It does want to win. It does want to be in control. It does desire these objects. Moreover, Pride comes about in dependence on this ignorance. Oh, I perceive this person has qualities greater than mine or lesser than mine. Pride arises. Jealousy too. So all the afflictions come about from the basis of this ignorance of self-grasping. And then from the ignorance of self-grasping come the afflictions. From these come the accumulation of contaminated karma, and from this, all suffering. This sequence needs to be realized. If you do not contemplate the sequence for remaining in samsara true origins, you will not understand how to cut the root of cyclic existence. So this sequence has to be correctly identified, and again, identified with a strength of mind that we then strive to eliminate it.
And those sometimes they don't na jiki nyawa kiawa lemba da idal kiawa lemba da tanga jiki ga dundul kiawa lemba da la da mil kiawa ne jisa lesa le yong kiawa ling du lesa gudi nyomo ba di zawatian da se marik pa sia de sha sambe di ha wo de da so so ine kiawa ngama ine kiawa ma nga zo nyewa le so sam ta so da nyewa le kiawa len yo de idale kiawa len yo dundul kiawa len yo la le kiawa le mil kiawa le da so so mi de de ne ki kiawa ba shu len cha le di len ba cha sa da le da nyomo ba de le de ne di ko ra di kya nya ko ra che kabrela and le ya ga sa ya mil kiawa ha le kiawa kabrela le du a sa de nga so la kiawa tu sin da de ba do kiawa ma mo de ne che ko ra che kiawa len de ba che sa dunga de le kyune tar tu yo ba de che sa ta ma do ba de ga che re lam na so su gi le nyomo ba de pa ma do ba nga su gi le nyomo ba pa ma do ba en za che sa nyomo ba da sin de pa ma do ba za di gi ye kabrela ko ro shuk che mo ke kabrela de sha shuk che mo ke an di gi che ne nga ba le nga ba sa je de dunga jin ya wa da nga so ki wa di cha gro 제가 되네 다들 봐도 깨워 먹고 실내 장가서 요 말에 이내 코발 깨냐 깨워 렌지 동화 깨냐 뇨도야 그래서 다 더누가 나랑 귤라 뇨모 받쳐서 하듯이 코발 깨워 렌게 규 뇨모 받쳐서 두스 제가 니메바 마서바 이내다 더누가 되네 게 깨워 렌게 와서 제가 다 니규도 뇨모 받이 메바 소도 삼제 제가 디 메바 소예제 뒷방고도 뒷방비 방바세야 뒷방선 탈바토고래 진짜 니 탈바토고도 선배게다 뒷방고도 선배 다 대간에서 방고래 라요도다 마즈랴 내가 녀모 마게기 그도 내가 녀모 마게 된다라 아니 아주 코르기야 내가 코르 마게라 가야라 잠재 삼다야 잠재 고미야리 아니 지 되샤 마게 되어라 미두보 고미야리 아니 지 가야 마게 된다라 샹리야 개발에 지수 일하지야다 안 두시잖아 구이바지야 안 지동지야 두시잖아 되자 맞게 된다라 아니데 나야서 그러다 맞게 된다라 샹리야 개발에 지수 일하지야다 샹리야 구십제가 있나 두신 내갑대 되네 제바나 맞아 내갑라 아니 지금은 바디게 가야 되고 마도 자원에 매봐서 두고 말다 자원에 매봐서야 되라 아니 nga juge da me be che ba si nga zu le nga se ba nga ra shi du ba kan des nang du de na wa na shi du ge mi du che ba du che ne dian qian zhe wa ju sam da che ba shi de da me ba to bu lo di ji go ro wa de che sa gang lai ma du ba ran yong de du ba sa wa ji de min du sam be sam de tong go ro wa de ne tong de ne gi lo de gom de ne tong ne de ne gom che de la mi be ge da dong ba ni le mi be ge da xin ne zhu de ne xin ne zhu che de ne delya shine dingane nomba ni be la dong zhubje an du chene bang gu du samje den zang ge di lam nyam len di den ji gi se be nyam len de je ge da sem shu ge je ma di to la de nyam len je de cha go ro ba
reflecting then on the sufferings of cyclic existence, reflecting on the expanse of time that we've been bound in these suffering realms, where we each have taken rebirth countless times in the hells, countless times as spirits, countless times as animals, humans, and gods. And this will just continue as it has done to now, because we remain bound by our habitual patterns. We remain without freedom because of our habitual patterns. We keep taking rebirth after rebirth because of this vast store of contaminated karma on our own continuums, which we ourselves accumulated through our own afflictions. And these afflictions all came from our own ignorance of self-grasping. And thereby, we ourselves keep ourselves bound in the samsara that we create. And this we've been doing lifetime after lifetime, and we will just continue to do so. And whilst there's been variation in as we are born from in one realm or another, as well as variation in experience in the realms, some rebirths are better than others, some worse than others. This just continues without respite, again and again, and will continue to do so until we manage to do what we have not yet done, which is to completely eradicate the afflicted minds together with their seeds. When we transform our continuum, transform our mind, so that the afflictions together with their seeds are removed, that is when we'll abide in freedom. We'll no longer be under the control of our habitual tendencies like we are now, our afflicted minds. This is the cause to achieve freedom, the meditation and the antidote to our suffering. The cause that keeps us bound is this ignorance. This is what we need to abandon. But doing so takes time and a lot of effort. So in conjunction with our endeavors to overcome the root cause of suffering, we also have to cultivate the causes that lead to a temporary lessening of our suffering, as well as the temporary reduction in our accumulation of non-virtue and the harm we bring to others. What this refers to then is that we shouldn't only focus on the eradication of the root of all suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping, because this takes time and is difficult and requires a lot of merit and the purification of a lot of non-virtue. We have to at the same time put great energy into developing temporary antidotes. Not only the final antidote, but the temporary antidotes. So for example, the anger that arises within us so readily, the frustration, the annoyance, to overcome this, we need to meditate on loving kindness. The stronger love and compassion arises within us, the contrary mind of anger will not be able to arise. Doesn't mean anger is eradicated from our continuum, but it does mean it will struggle to arise in proportion to the strength of the love and kindness and tenderness that we cultivate within us. Likewise, the stronger we cultivate the mind of dissatisfaction towards the delights of samsara and samsara as a whole, the weaker our attachment will be for the pleasures of samsara. Furthermore, the more we meditate on the qualities of others and rejoice in their good deeds, and we come to appreciate them and recognize their qualities, the weaker our pride will be and our competitiveness will be. So these and other temporary antidotes are crucial to train in because of many benefits. These aid us. These are the crucial assistants or companions, the crucial assistants to our indispensable cultivation of concentration and wisdom, because it's cultivating these temporary antidotes that reduce the strength of the afflictions, reduce the strength of our negative karma, the obstacles to our spiritual development, and it's the cultivation of these temporary antidotes that strengthen our store of virtue. And in this way, we experience more happiness now, we bring greater benefit to others now, we stop harming others in the same way, and we're removing obstacles and accumulating virtue that aids our development of concentration and wisdom. And these are the primary antidotes to the attainment of freedom. So this comes about through meditating on the sequence for remaining in samsara, and then thereby striving to develop the antidotes.
Sile ngejung Geshe Tenpa kowa gange jingpa sheba je sidu jizna denegi yok sibo kowa liya pa jik gyuen da jipen gyuen da dene ngejung dele de matana tamle pe gyuen rangshin resha se gyuen da je dene dele matana tamde tagudu sampe samlo jang ko denegi da tagudu sam jang du da kowa jingyagi garis gyuga를 dine 기구로 세 de sheba na jung nyomodele 기구도 sampe du jeba jene 너 둥아기 되게 되니서 하고 둥아를 타르되겠어. 진짜 둥아기 규용해야 돼. 녀모 받이게 하고 봐 제시. 근데 가른 냠는 제에선 제시도 돼 제바시도 배 자침부지 냠는 제에 가르람나. 진짜 진바 추팀 아 추름 송에도 룽아 예수 예지 덤 추름 송해야 돼. 추름 송해야다. 되니까 쇠바kom이야. 쇠바kom 써야 돼. 소수게 냠는 제도 갑라 강아요도 갈라 델이야 쇠바kom이야 차고를 현지 녀바지 발로 쇠바kom이야. 근데 쇠바kom이야. 된 전리 좀. 근데 안직 야라다 라마 이름 내야래 몰람잡 내 몰람자야다. 누시네는 되네 다음에 비치 다음에 발에 제바제제. 다 소소듯이 다신디 유디 진바나신 두에 민두스 두 제바제. 제바 전에 하는 가슴제 제바 제연도 가슴질라 진바나 자오기니 민두 세배 다메바데 통으로 통 세배 jel레디네 다메바 또 세배제 다메발 미비 신이 주고 그래서 신이 줍제 되네 다메발 미비 신이 딩안에 동바 하동 줍제 두전 람데베 자침보 다디 자침보 전당아 코르위 누가 타달래 타야게 탑람당아 나랑의 녀모 받쳐서 매바 쇠게 탑람데 다디레샤 삼제 게 침보지 무진의 자침보진에 안에 바냠는 제고래 시대 제바지 셰바지스 안디젤이야 나주라면 가서 나주라면에 나중에 냠는 데달제 탈도다게 되지 cancel로 세대 제름치기 네네 냠마도 수수진 냠는 도스진에 도삼 다지 냠는 제바이 다 결혼주의네 고외 동안 타달래 탈고 가서 니나신지 냠는 제 아스는 거 절랍치고래
The 20th verse then continues. So, it is vital to rely on disenchantment to renounce samsara and to know which factors chain us in the cycle of existence. So this summarizes then what we looked at before with the first noble truths, where one needs to reflect on the faults of samsara, coming to see that samsara is bound. Samsara is in the nature of suffering, and therefore there is actually not a moment of respite of suffering that has ever been experienced by a samsaric being. Suffering is sometimes far more intense, sometimes less so, but as long as one's physical and mental aggregates are in the nature of suffering, one can only suffer. Having come to see this with vivid clarity, and naturally given rise therefore to the wish to be freed of this state, we look then at the causes, and we come here to see at the sequence of contaminated karma, accumulated, or suffering comes from contaminated karma, which comes from the afflicted minds, which have as their root cause the ignorance of self-grasping. We see this sequence then, with vivid clarity, because it's this sequence which are the factors which chain us in the cycle of existence. So this we need to then secondly see with vivid clarity, because it's these two meditations which give us the determination to transform our life, transform what we value, what we prioritize, to put all our energy, every mental thought, into ensuring we are not creating the causes that keep us bound in cyclic existence, but rather the causes for freedom. And with this as a motivation, we meditate in a similar manner to before on ethical restraint, on the determination not to bring harm to ourselves or others. And this is, in brief, the determination to guard our mind from the arisal of the afflictions. And at this point, we have seen with such vivid clarity the danger that the afflictions pose. We have a determination that is stronger than ever, never to be deceived by the afflictions. Secondly, generate the wish to cultivate generosity, not only so as to cultivate the causes that lead to liberation, but also knowing that others are suffering in the same way that we are. We want to help, we want to give. We develop this wish to give, whether it's materially, whether it's of our skills and talents. We generate this wish to be of benefit to others, the practice of generosity. And then independent on this determination not to harm, but rather to benefit, we meditate on the third, that of patience. Here this is developing love and concern for others, or not wanting others to suffer, as well as wanting to gain freedom of suffering for ourselves. And this then means that whatever unwanted circumstance we encounter, whether it's from others, or whether it's our own inner turmoil, or whether it's an obstacle to our spiritual training, we are patient with this. In that, we do not allow this obstacle to overwhelm us. We do not allow it to lead to the arisal of afflictions. Here we train in patience with renewed effort, renewed vigor. Fourthly, we continue our training in joyous perseverance, delighting in our training, delighting in the virtue that we are accumulating, and rejoicing in our success, in our spiritual training, rejoicing in the reduction of our afflictions and our spiritual progression, as well as the rejoicing in the endeavors that others are making too. And then, with this as an indispensable basis, we then meditate on the root cause that keeps us bound in suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping, coming to see how the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears, and meditating on cultivating wisdom, seeing that it is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And each time we come to see this, we hold it with concentration, strengthening both our mind of concentration as well as our realization of the self not existing in the way that it appears. This is how we are to train. And the verse concludes with Je Rinpoche exhorting us to please train like he trained, and thereby we will receive the result that he achieved. And he trained in this way because this is how all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas train. So he's exhorting us to follow his example. I, a yogi, have practiced in this manner. You who aspire for liberation should do likewise.
Tata kibu dingi lam nyamlen chidu ngazo deshi nyama kibu chungi lam jirimba samdana de chasan samdangu gore ada pene kibu dingi lam nyamlen chibu kable ne kiwi shinye tigeria ane kiwi shinyo komyati kiwi shinye le tebata an gedin chisu tebata an jike delia ane digor wada kusu yuden tembe thone an deba komya ane gedin chisu teya an delia an jike dos communga and di mese di nashe koyu dunga de nyawa yida dunro and chiki ta digalia lata mi ko kan skeve ne dunga rashi resha sembe sometime dango gorwa de chibare ane nyamlen je de karachine jimbada sujino sebada and zunje nyamlen je gore digala ane sometime da sherab nyamlen je ro ta jamro she gore jamro ane na deshi nganzo Chabradosia, Jambrella Kibu Chunga, Jamlin Chivicabla, Mahasung, Dunga de la Targus, Tele to be new by the conscious of Yores in a Jambrosherva. That Dadan Kibu Tingical Kesha, Mahason, Koyu Dunga Tadale, Targo, Tele to be new by the Sulia, Jamna conscious of Yores, then Jamjo consum Kibures and be in the Jambrosher. That's all Kuno de Danganzogi, Kuno de Caricabra Yoros, and Kuno de la Kibu Tingica, Tarva said. Nyomomba pangbi pangba tarba se togudu sebe tarba doni sambe kune laje di kune la kunlo digi thone dangde jamro jeare jimbe nyamne suje nyamne jeare andus jene di jeare wade kunlo dile di chagore jesa nyamne jeade manga cheba jigbare jesa dine za 다 기부 딩기 람냠니 집에 갑라 가서 기부 중요히 그 갑라 삼다에 차상상 땅고 그래지 땅고 곰 니강라나 예 가소리 이제 딩해진다 다음에 봐도 비 셰랍 냠내체 쪽으로 지착으로 와 모두시
I hope, so what I want to emphasize now is that in order to train successfully in these trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, the indispensable foundation is the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity. The latter is based on the former. This is crucial. The whole Lamrim is set out in a specific sequence and needs to be trained in this way. In order for one's training in the Four Noble Truths to be successful, one needs to have meditated well and to be training well in our reliance on our teacher, have strong trust and conviction in him, have reflect repeatedly on his kindness and the great benefit that comes through relying on him. And then thereafter to also meditate on the other, to have meditated on the other trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, including the sufferings of the lower realms, because this leads to the bridge that comes later. We meditate here on the preciousness of our human rebirth, its impermanence, refuge, lower realms, and then we engage in those trainings of ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, and possibly, if one wishes, concentration and wisdom. Then when we have that basis secure, the basis is firm rather, then we have the foundation for successful training as a practitioner of intermediate capacity. What should be clear is the great similarity between these two practitioners is the practices they engage in. Both types of practitioners meditate on ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance. The only difference in the practices are that a practitioner of intermediate capacity explicitly meditates on concentration and wisdom, whereas for a practitioner of initial capacity, those two, concentration and wisdom, are optional. So the great difference then between a practitioner of initial and intermediate capacity is their motivation and the goal that the motivation desires. The goal that is desired by a practitioner of intermediate capacity is complete liberation, not just from the lower realms, but from samsara in its entirety. And as that goal differs, the motivation to achieve it is different. And to give rise to that motivation, therefore, is a differing meditation. For the practitioner of initial capacity, that was the suffering of the lower realms, to give rise to their motivation. Here, for a practitioner of intermediate capacity, they build on that previous meditation. And here, they reflect, though, on the fault of samsara in its entirety, not just of the lower realms. And it's that which we saw at the beginning of verse 19, which is the cause that leads to the arisal of the motivation that is unique to a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So that is the similarities as well as the differences between practitioners of initial and intermediate capacity.
아디나야 상여점내디기나 추유콜라 담보고에도 제사 담보 동아디 하고 그래 동아하고 그래서 제사 동아 셔바자스 제사 동아디 내수야고 하고 제 동아디 동아레샤 삼하고 근데 나 동아디 규디 가는 용구도 무슨 규리야 삼땅고레스 제사디 아니 군중 방와자스 되니 동아 규하데 군주 템바데 방고레스 되니 셔바제 고레스 제사 군주 템바다 하고도 군주도 방배 타르바 되니 셔바제도 다 군주 레다 녀모 방배 방바도 토야도 삼하고 두 그래스 제사디 고바세요 고바군도 자스 자, 디 토백에 냠는 제디 가래서는 람공고래서는 람공 세딩 안 되다 니중 코알 타고도 선배 타도 군에 라제 진부스르서 전리 삼대 셔 냠는 제디로 어디서 공고래서 디네자 람 공바자사지 상여 좀 내디 소야디 두스치도 소로와
when Buddha Shakyamuni taught the Four Noble Truths, he summarized them by saying, the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, needs to be known. That's what we looked at the beginning of verse 19. Suffering needs to be known. Thereafter, he taught the origin of suffering, the causes that lead to the result of suffering. These, having been recognized, need to be abandoned. So here, one recognizes that the causes, the origin of all suffering, are the ignorance of self-grasping. Because from this come all the afflicted minds, and from that the accumulation of contaminated karma and suffering. This needs to be abandoned, the ignorance of self-grasping. Then the third noble truth, truth of cessation, this is to be attained. What is cessation? What is it that needs to be attained? The origin of suffering needs to be completely eradicated. The afflicted minds, together with their seeds, need to be abandoned. Thereby, cessation is attained. Third noble truth. The fourth, how is that achieved? The path needs to be meditated, or the path needs to be cultivated. These mental paths of ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. These mental paths need to be cultivated. They need to be meditated. This Buddha Shakyamuni taught.
Dundala nga kiwu dingi lam nyamlin che siri nga gom jaya de samtang de kar samtang gore la ne ta nga jele kowi dunga ta nyawa kowa ka de skebe ne ne kamsum ka ne samta ne dunga irashi re do se be dunga ji samta dunga yongda da ka ne ngu che ba samta di tang bodhi samta ta niba de la kar samtang was ne ta de ne ge dunga de le kyube niba de jamje koncho sum ya jam ko ju gyogure smp ge samta yi shi che jamro che ya de wa 안디네 안 가르쳐 왔습니다. 동아디 유디 가르는 것도 있는데 달래다 녀모 받는 용도도 와 간의 용도 녀모 받는 간의 용도도 레 간의 용도도 제받치네 또 삼다 귤이야 삼다들와 군주디바 동아 여야가 유디 가르는 용도도 란다 레다 녀모 받는 용도에서 귤이야 삼다들이지 당보 동아 삼다들와 동아 삼다의 동아를 들려 껴변 누가 수교고에서 권적숨라 열에서 되는 권적 교고에서며 겸르셔야 되지 제 수작으로와 다대께는 교고에 나나 간스 교고에 랍되다 동아디게 규리 가르에서 귤이야 삼다 제가 내가 녀모바데 용고에서 다 녀모바데야 되자 코로 뭐또 예배 망보 예배 나는 저 소소기 귤기 다세 말이 벌써 레샤스 내가 삼다제 대 삼다는다 다세 말이 버데 마바는 탑은 뒷방고도 셈비게 다 디방고 심비게 빠야게 된다라 당이 람냠는 지기인세 삼다지로와 그래서 동알 빵배 탈바 토구도 그래서 디토비알라 된다라 나중에 뭐 빵배 빵고도 디빠야라 당이 람냠는 지기스 다 람냠는 가르치고 그래서 당보 코란이야 지 류가 예수 예주도 추름송 이 류가 예수 예바자와긴 지금 에서 삼다도 가서는 동아 녀모 바기에 고가고로와 안데가야 되네 진배 냠내 지야다 가서는 집에서 내는 수입에 냠내자 더 전주에 냠내자 또 시긴스 림바신 도체 근데 다음에 벽걸이야 삼다 녀모바 다음에 봐서 되는 녀모 라신이 주바 라를 나와 나신 나지 두에면도 도체 제바체 삼다에 다음에 배 삼다 책으로 도체 삼다 냠내 지긴스는 되네 털려 양 중에 즉 가야지 연거 거미야디다 딱이부 등기값이 냠내 제다디 책으로
Summarize then the trainings that a practitioner of intermediate capacity goes through. The first, as we saw, is to reflect in detail on the sufferings of samsara. There's the threefold division, the sixfold division, the eightfold division. These need to be reflected on well, because this gives rise to the motivation that is required for one to be a practitioner of intermediate capacity. One requires this reflection so as to overcome the wrong view that this, what is an unbearable prison of samsara, we still believe is somewhere that has pleasure, that has happiness. This needs to be abandoned. And it comes through the developing of wisdom, through reflecting on the sufferings of samsara repeatedly over a sustained period. The second part of the meditation then is refuge. And here, the refuge objects, of course, are the same. So the process of going for refuge is the same as previously, but one does so with a different motivation. One is turning towards the three jewels, knowing that they have the ability to guide us to attain liberation from suffering in its entirety. The three jewels have the ability to guide us to develop the Dharma jewel within ourselves. And the Dharma jewel is true cessations and true paths. And that is cessation of suffering. That is liberation or nirvana. That's the second step, refuge. The third is to reflect on true origins. So here we reflect on the causes of our suffering, the origin of suffering. And that is the contaminated karma that abides on our own continuum, that we ourselves accumulate through our own afflicted minds, which all come from our own ignorance of self-grasping. This is the origin of all our suffering. Gaining vivid clarity on that, there'll be no doubt that we have to guard our mind against the arisal of afflictions. And as soon as they arise, knowing that they endanger us and others, they have to be abandoned. How so? Fourth part of the meditation. First, suffering samsara. Second, refuge. Third, origin. Fourth, train in the paths. So the mental paths are ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. All 6 of these. So that of ethical restraint remains the foundation. And here, one's ethics will be even stronger than previously, because one will have a greater understanding of the danger of the afflictions, the danger that the afflictions will pose. We will here, in this meditation, have the determination not to allow them to influence us, because of the danger they pose to ourselves and to others. This enables our meditation on ethics to be so much more powerful, and thereby our strength to guard our mind with mindfulness and introspection so much more effective. And we continue the meditations on generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, cultivating concentration and wisdom, meditating that on firstly how the self appears, and then looking to see if it exists in this way, coming to see that it does not. In this way, come to realize the self does not exist in the way that it appears. And we develop the wisdom realizing selflessness. Having trained well, or having established well the second foundation, the foundation of the practices that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, one then is suitably qualified to train exclusively with all one's endeavor in the practices that are unique to practitioners of greatest capacity.
다 대화 진비기 최 냠린 제야 다 당봉 안주 간리시 오래스네 다 대신 안주게 기부 진기를 냠린 제베 갑라 다 아주 동안 용거에 코발이 끼워라 차상 레다 녀모봉이 끼워 링기도 차상 다 레다 녀모바데 소수 귤레 두스 차상디 디빵후도 소수 코에 동아 타달라 타발라 소수 녀모다 빵후도 대대 빵비게 빵는 타바 토부도 선비게 삼로 따르바다 두스진에 삼도 자한자 다 가르 태바 침비 냠는 제바 때까블라데 가르지야스네 대시 소소 나라 소소 귤이 녀모바 여바디 빵구도 삼비 빵네 다 타바 토구도 선비 삼로디 파 대시 소설 삼다 다파 현달라 가보체 샘전 탐제를 삼다제 지사 샘전 탐제다 냐와 바다 이다다 눈로게다 하다 미다 샘전 랑세드 직불에 샘전세드 바도 메바시 타예바시요레스 대주 차상 대저 동아야 유에 동아야 네 데니게 잡아주 동아 용어되여서 제가 두세 삼다 동아 대지 녀마 대지 삼다 동아 삼다 집어로 와다 두 삼다네 디수 동아디게 유디 가르리게 오르세네 다 대지 나지 집어래 유디 가르세네 레다 녀모 발레드네 기고르세 제가 레다 녀모 버드네 깨완사다 Semjan tam jo koala korchino dunga nyoje de leda nyomo poreshas. Dide leda nyomo bode semjan kora so gyule yedirwada. 제가 semjan tam jo koyo dunga de le taje leda nyomo ba dunga de le taje 가서 dunga nyoyo gyu leda nyomo ba de banghudu. Ndi bang ne semjan tam je gygi leda nyomo ba de bangje. De bang ne ya tarbi고 봐 토구도 sembe sam다르와다. 데네 sam다는 갈리그레스네 데네 sam다다 semjan 탐제 고유 동을 타데다 네 제후도 sembe게 소설이야 기내지. 네 제후도 sembe 라사 남다 sam다. 네 제후도 sembe sam로디 딜리고르와다. 동을 semjan 탐제 동을 빼 냥도 봐 세고 하고도 다 동을 딜레 터야 되는 네 탑시 맞은 탑에는 네 제후도 sembe게 소설이야 심심슈시게 오래. 디게 요도 안에 같이 왔던 다는 알제도 나래야 안에 뉴발가 미도하다 제사다 했으면 탐제산 거기 동안 탈제 야 탈바 탐제킴 먹고 화나 야기엘이야 안에 같이 왔으면 네 나랑 이게 요모도 방고도 나랑 줄에 대차 공로 나제 여바이나 이게 샤리야 뇌마도 판도지도 그래서 내가 공로에는 샤라 뇌도 대차게는 샤라 뇌도 제가 나랑 줄에 대차 요모 공로 뒷방고도 제가 네 나랑 그卷지 찾아 방아지네 연된 토고에기 릭 찾아 토고 제가卷군세 연된 군디베 사요고바 마토는 탑미도 세베 사요고바 토고쇼 세베 삼로디 다 장주 셈세오라 디게 오고래 제르와다 지사디 장주 셈게 와디 디네게 와 규시모래 지사 디네게 장주 셈게 셈자 탐지기도 사요고바 토고도 셈베 장주 셈디 게라 예라 가르고고스 셈자한테 누가데 네세긴 세베 삼로 숙체모 고래스 대숙체모 메나 장주 셈게 두고 말해제 셈자 탐지 누가데 네세고도 셈베 숙체모 레발라 셈징이 누가데게 야고 삼다제 셈자 탐지 참 디기 덴바다 누가 고고도 셈베게 안 삼당와데 게침모 차고 그래서 누스는 삼당고 그래서 당연히 담이라 울로데를 걸었어 다sem자 탐지기 된다는 산지고 봐 토고 토버쇼 셈베 장주 셈게 그래서 당연히 태바침베게 최게 다들 냐면 제다디 누스당보도 삼당고 그래서
To understand how these three trainings that are shared between practitioners of initial, intermediate, and then the unshared practices of the beings of greatest capacity, how they interrelate, one builds on the other. I've already mentioned how the practitioner of intermediate capacity needs to have trained in the practices of initial capacity, that is their foundation. So similarly, these two trainings of the beings of initial and intermediate capacity need to be cultivated well, because that is the indispensable foundation for a practitioner of greatest capacity. And to illustrate this, the way that one enters into the paths of the Mahayana Dharma is to have trained in exactly the same way as the practitioner of initial and then intermediate capacity has trained. Then, having gained realization of these paths, coming to see with vivid clarity how suffering pervades every being that is bound in samsara, that they have yet to experience a moment of peace, and will actually, as long as they remain bound in cyclic existence, will never experience peace. That needs to have been realized, as well as the origin of this predicament. Contaminated karma and the afflictions with the ignorance of self-grasping at their root. And that freedom is possible from this. Cessation is possible, and this is done through the cultivation of the mental paths. Independent on that realization, the aspirant to the paths of the Mahayana Dharma takes this realization that they have achieved in relation to themselves and asks themselves the question, who around me that I can perceive, that I've perceived throughout this life, or any being throughout all the realms of samsara, is any different from me in this regard? And it's that question, that independence on the success of the prior training, will hit them in a profound manner. They will come to see that these limitless beings, pervading the expanse of space, are in the exact same predicament, bound and lost in darkness and confusion of their own ignorance, continuously creating causes that lead to their suffering, their pain, and their misery. All are suffering. All are suffering. The causes of their suffering are the same. Ignorance leading to affliction, afflictions leading to contaminated karma. And that all abides on their own individual continuums. They themselves, just like I have been doing, keep themselves bound in this pain. And their solution is exactly the same as mine. They need to attain liberation through eliminating the afflicted minds and their seeds. And this way, one comes to see that there is no basis for differentiation or distinction between self and other than where the contaminated karma abides and is accumulated. But all beings, other than that, are the same. When that hits the practitioner in a profound manner, the strong wish to help others will arise. And this strong wish will arise in dependence on their own spiritual development that the practitioner has gone through their own identification of their suffering and its origins, and that something can be done about it, and their success thus far in training in the cultivation of mental paths. In dependence on this, they know liberation for themselves is possible, and therefore liberation for others is possible too. They know this. And that gives them strength of mind. They can help those that are lost in the realms of suffering and pain. They can help those who are lost in the darkness of confusion. But this skilled practitioner knows, though, that they do not right now have the capacity to do that. They are still lost in they are still in samsara, bound in samsara themselves. They are striving. They are for freedom. Freedom they know is possible, but they are still bound. Thereby, the strong wish to benefit others serves to propel the practitioner to strive ever harder. And moreover, strive not to attain merely their own liberation, but to strive in order to become the most skilled of practitioners, the most skilled of guides, to help others. The strength of the impact of this realization leads them to develop the determination not only to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds, but even the imprints or the stains of the afflictions, and thereby eradicate the slightest trace of fault. And moreover, not to develop all good qualities to the extent that liberation is achieved for themselves, but to perfect all good qualities. In other words, they commit to striving to becoming a perfected being, a Buddha, for the sake of others. And this is the cultivation of bodhicitta. This is the entry point to the path of the Mahayana Dharma. And the generation of bodhicitta comes about primarily in dependence on this altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, where this individual, this one person, takes it as their responsibility, their own personal responsibility, to become a Buddha so that they can guide each and every sentient being without exception to the cultivation of their own good qualities and the eventual attainment of their own liberation. They take the suffering of others and its eradication as their individual responsibility. And it's independence on the strength of this mind, the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, that bodhicitta is born and the Mahayana paths are entered.
Dene zadang azo deshi kibu tingi kabla samda du kamsum kowa semje tam ji dunga samda dunga ya gyudi nyomoba nyomoba dike samda. Dene tamma dile kar samda so nyomoba sosu gyule yor chesa sosu gi kowe dunga le tarya gi danda nyomo banggodu sembe sosul jibu samda sharwa. Dadi chakwa chenpi gi chue nyamne chewe kabla da deshi nashin semje tam ji dunga samda ta jikba che. 다 담야달라 다 소소나 삼마다치 제산 동아디 녀모의 규제 심장 탐지기 녀모 규제셔 제 심장 탐지 규규 녀모바다 방구도 삼르데다 대시 소소기 녀모바 방구 선배 삼르디 파샤제 카데 파제 심장 탐지기 녀모바 방구도 제산다 심장 탐지레 디기고 녀모 마바바이나 심장 탐지 동아 바도 메바고 제 심장 탐지레 디기고도 디기 용알라 동아디 메바 소고도 dunga meba ya suwala dunga yu nyomoba de meba so udu se big samdaya di da de kibo chimbe lam nyamne je de jamni je samli korwa da dene inza an dene ya an chi da dene ge semja tham je nyomoba pangbe panggo dele kyobe dunga ta de kyobe nyuba suyorasne jamne ko josuna yores jamne ko josuna kyoburi sembe ichi je de 나디 겸리 차바침에 겸리 차고라 셈냐 탐지 누가 다달로 끼베 니버수로 겸냐 건주스면 껴고래서 비치치야디 차바침에 겸러서 니 두스 겸러셔라 두스 겸러 제세에 제라 다 셈냐 탐지기 레나 녀모바데 파파야 다 메바 니 방기 니 탑이치기 메바 수기 인사디 그래서네 셈냐 탐지라려 진첨보 깨진 첨보 진첨보 깨진 첨보 제라야 콘술레 데니기 지게 강아 체도 되깔라 다딩이 파 콘술레 팬토 지가 메바 마순데 탑민도 저지당이 메바 수기 인세지 니 탑이치 인세베 삼다데다 나 저게 파사 남나사 차그로 제가 데니 두스 삼단다 니 메바 수와라 제가 나라래야 아니지 콘주게다 가시 저저 콘줄레 취시 냠는 제주도 지난 메바 수월마다 제 메바 수에 메르와 제가 제서와라 소수기 아니 차상한지 콘주 감나 메바 간디스네 판도 체도 차상 신고로와 아니 소수기 셰알라 야 소수기 마신 바다 소수기 녀모 어디서와나 판도 제도 말아 제가 디 술로여 상기랑 레샤스다 녀모 바차사 빵제 연된 차상 된지 다 차상 상기셔 상기고 보마도 탑미도 세베 당에 상기고 보토바 지 세베 장요 셈기 냠는 제디 다 두시는 아주 삼는 땅다 림바디 디차고 잡아치 미취 냠는 제기 다 지금 다 디차고 봐
It's important that you understand very clearly the bridge between the practices that are shared with the being of intermediate capacity to come into the practices of the being of greatest capacity. So having trained in the way that has been presented for a practitioner of initial or intermediate capacity, the key step then is to take those realizations of the sufferings of cyclic existence, their origins, that cessation is possible and how to achieve it, the paths to be cultivated, and then take this, which all these meditations which have been primarily focused on my experiences, what I observe, and my need to be freed of pain, and then change the focus to others. Coming to see that everything that I've realized in relation to myself is equally applicable to all other sentient beings. They and I are no different except in number. I am one, they are limitless. Just like I am bound in these realms of suffering, so are they. We're suffering in the same way, for the same reasons. The difference between self and others really is, I'm one of the very few who have come to realize this. They still believe happiness is possible in samsara. They have no idea that true happiness is possible and how to achieve it. They do not know the depths of the suffering they are experiencing. So this knowledge, this realization, is really what distinguishes us, all that does so. Thinking like this then should hit one in a powerful manner, coming to see that all these limitless beings are in pain and misery but theirs is exacerbated by the ignorance of confusion, a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Here then, compassion and love starts to arise. The wish, may they all be freed of pain and misery. May they all experience lasting and stable happiness. Because there are so many, they are more important than me. I therefore have to help them. Because I am already bound for spiritual development and liberation because of my realizations thus far, my understanding of the Four Noble Truths. There is hope for me. There's very definite hope for me. I am not helpless anymore, but they are. And they need help and assistance. Here we're generating love and compassion for them. And at this point then, we turn our mind to the three jewels. We go for refuge. And here again, the refuge is different. The objects are the same, but the aspiration is different. Here, returning for refuge, knowing that it's only the three jewels who can guide us to become a perfected being, the most skilled of guides, a guide who has perfected all good qualities and completely eradicated all faults, and thereby is skilled to lead beings in accordance with their own dispositions. Here we turn for refuge in order to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of others. And this is the generation of the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, where we commit to whatever I can do to help, I will do so. And in order to help others, I have to perfect all good qualities and completely eradicate all faults. That means I have to become a Buddha for the sake of others. And this is the generation of bodhicitta. So what we're really doing here is changing a focus from self to others, where our primary concern is others achieving liberation from suffering, not ourselves. But in order to achieve our primary concern, we end up achieving our own liberation and enlightenment, because that is how we become skilled to help others. But this whole process from now, though, is not about I have to achieve liberation. It's I have to achieve the liberation of others. To do so, as a byproduct, I become liberated and enlightened. So that is the key difference here.
Gunlo di le semje tham ji sanje ko ma to chi gu sembi gunlo di ro da che sa janshu sem sa de che sa da janshu sem gunlo di de da nyamlen je de khare la ne jimba suju seba zunju samde sherap nyamlen je de ane deshi jimba suju seba zunju samde sherap sa di nyamlen di ki bu jingi ne ga sa nyamlen je ko ko ro wa nyamlen je ji ba de ta ba chimbe ka bla nyamlen je di jimba da suju seba zunju du de 기부 딩이 값은 냠내체 디툭티리 가르 개발이어서 군노 개발을 받아 기부 딩이 값을 가서 나랑 기기 녀모 빵배 타바 토쿠도 선배 군노 디르와 디군내라지 냠내체의 지모스를 줘봐 자로 나데 타바 집이 냠내체 샘장 탐지기 된다려야 네 상조고 방 토쿠도 지 군노 디자슈 디 된다려 하는 게 냠내체 가르쳐 지모스를 줘봐 냠내체기 해서디 냠내체의 지발에 다 타바 침비 걸려 냠내체 태와 가려서는 다 랑치징이 삼로디 랑치징이 랑을 제바쯤에 삼로디 괜다제 랑치징 삼로디 파빵아제 대현을 제바쯤에 삼로디 고미야디 대 직차고 마이기부 징기급라 랑치징이 요르바 디방고 말제 녀바다고 말 랑치징 괜탕 다제는 현제바 삼당고 말에 다 기부 침비 가서 태바쯤에 님을 집에 갑라 제가 랑치징 다들 삼방아 코와를 코르되어지 가서 나 생각랑 제벌 진지에 니기 장장전에 녀모밖에 해야 되는 제가 랑치진세 노트레샤 제가 랑치진데 괜레샤서 랑치진을 괜다 랑치진을 빵제 현래 제벌진다 Shen cheba shen yaku yong dondala ngarang garjina kanga chena dunga nyona nyong garjina chesngi shen le pemba chumne digu zambe samtaje shen cheba zimbe samtadi dadi taba chimbe chue nyamne chebe kabla da kulwa cha yusim kune laje jinso pashin tuk nyamne che jiba che andiga la rang che zingi gyenta shen cheba zimbe samlo komedire.
Earlier, I mentioned the similarities and differences between the practitioners of initial and intermediate capacity. So we saw that the difference was primarily in their motivation and the goal that this motivation was striving to achieve. And the practices were very similar. Ethical restraint, generosity, joyous perseverance, and patience. Concentration and wisdom remained optional for the practitioner of initial capacity, but crucial for the practitioner of intermediate capacity. Now, for the practitioner of greatest capacity, the practices are very similar. The goal and motivation is, of course, very different. The motivation is bodhicitta, to become a Buddha for the sake of others, so that one can free all beings from suffering. Two key components of bodhicitta. So become a Buddha for the sake of others in order to free all beings from suffering. So that's the motivation. The goal is enlightenment, Buddhahood. So this is, of course, unique to a practitioner of greatest capacity. The practices, though, are common to those of intermediate and initial capacity. Ethical restraint, generosity, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. So the practices are shared. However, there is one further practice that is unique or not shared. One unique practice of the practitioner of greatest capacity is the cultivation of the other cherishing mind and the complete eradication of the self-cherishing mind. This is a unique training of a practitioner of greatest capacity. The practitioners of initial and intermediate capacity do train under the influence of the self-cherishing mind. It doesn't impede their attainment of their goal. It is the greatest impediment to the achievement of the goal of a bodhisattva. The self-cherishing mind, or it can be expressed as the mind of self-interest, the mind of self-obsession, is the mind that puts one's own interest first and foremost. If there's benefit to others, that's fine, but first and foremost is myself. This is completely contrary to the motivation of a bodhisattva. It is the primary obstacle to the cultivation of bodhicitta and the development of bodhicitta, the strengthening and growth of bodhicitta, and therefore it is a unique object of abandonment, of eradication by the bodhisattva, this mind of self-obsession or self-interest, the self-cherishing mind.
Alright, that in that anzo yoke anzo samdana the kibu tingi lam yamne chetadire, Chisadini, Zatangazo, the Karsi was in Angazo, Koyu Dunga de la Tarji Tarbo Togudu, Sempe, some died, Tarbo Toyeg Dundala, Tarbo Dunya, some Lakia Dundala, Kamsumki, and the same gentamchi, Nyomo Bada, Nikas Dunga some diet, Dunga you led a Nyomo Balakigores, Chisadinigi, do some diet, did I let a Nyomo Batilla Cuba, new body Sulet, Jamia Conchosum Mayore, Jamia Conchosum Cubres, and be Jamdra Sheadam, and Delia, Dinenga Zugidi, and Denecine, Duscom, Gene, Ta Susugula, Koaliki, Nyomo Susugula, your Chesa Nyomo, Suzuki, Nyomo, Pankudu, Sempiki, Dene some touching on Zugida. Chicks so ya loss of other silver come your loss of the Nikan, the Shabana Jinyam count to the share. That the nigger so arangida, the nigger yomo, but you would drink a comes from yomo, but do not have to get some time machine burner, give it champion and yamnachella, Missy Gida, or got do not sometimes lost some time where Yamar, they didn't sometime do not more trade by Inza, Delia, some loti, Rang, do not towels and be some little pa shache. Shensimje tamje dunga tahudu matana tabminu shensimje le digi hudu sepigi jamje komya chagarwa jamje komya nika ko dunga di 대신에 심전 탐지 감수미 dunga tamje samtaanza 다 sam다 dunga yoba sebu rachawaenza choyo도네 gebu chimpa samtaedo oda 랑 대화도 심전 탐제래 digi hudu te koz을 강아지 대기 메바 강아도 심전 탐지 digi 다나 셈비게 잠바 sam다 지사다 심전 탐지 dunga들 차고 우두 다나 셈비게 지사 dunga디 영화에 귀디듯이 레다 녀모바 기부딩이 qabla sam다디로와 직바로와 지사 레다 녀모발에 되는 중고 지사 다 심전 탐지기 레다 녀모바 빵고도 디마바나 지기면도 셈비게 대삼다 디바데 다 내지기 삼제 내지기 내 콘줄 바빵 빠지 콘차상기 레다 녀모바데 내 메바 쓰기스 되네게 삼다로와 다디 메바 쓰바라 내 상지고 봐 토바지기 지사사요고 봐 토버쇼 셈베다 남적인 도스치네 장주셈 고미하기 다디 쇼웨 가서 셰디기 도스친 림바 삼라다 로 장다 림바디 되네시 삼다로와 다직디다 된마 대타바침벨람 냠내제 림바디다 이거 잡로 맞지 마셔야지
And to summarize what we've looked at then this morning, is we've looked at the trainings in brief of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, seeing that the imperative foundation, having come through the meditations from the practitioner of initial capacity, is now to meditate on the faults of cyclic existence in its entirety. So one has already meditated effectively on the sufferings of the lower realms, and now one reflects on the sufferings of humans and gods. This is the indispensable foundation for the practitioner to come to see there's no peace, there's no respite of suffering to be found within samsara. There's not a single samsaric experience that is freed of suffering. And this then, meditated deeply, leads to a wish to be freed from the suffering, realizing that there is no freedom to be found in samsara. We wish for freedom of samsara and we turn to look for the causes of our suffering. And we see that these are the afflicted minds, particularly the ignorance of self-grasping. And this leads to an ever stronger determination not only be influenced by the afflictions, but to eradicate them. Here we then see that cessation is possible through the cultivation of the path, and we strive at that. But when we give rise to in our meditation, to seeing the faults of samsara and the causes of the suffering, that is when we go for refuge to the three jewels, with the motivation that we know that it's through relying on the three jewels that that they can skillfully guide us to achieve cessation through the eradication of our afflictions. So we go for refuge there, and that is then the foundation or the basis for the meditation then on the paths. Then the bridge comes, as we've seen now in what we've looked at in the latter part, that we've take this whole meditation that has been about coming to truly recognize our experience in samsara with honesty and vivid clarity, and take this and apply it to the situation of others. We come to see that others are in exactly the same situation as us, in that they are suffering in myriad ways wherever they are born, and they too have never experienced true moment of freedom or pain. And that as long as they remain bound in samsara, they will continue to suffer without hope. Because the one difference, the primary difference between ourselves and them, is that we have come to see that freedom is possible, and we are, through our training in the paths, progressing to achieve freedom. Others, though, are lost in darkness, confusion of pain and misery and ignorance. When this hits one, naturally love and compassion will arise in us in an intense manner. And through the power of this love and compassion arising within us, a commitment to help others will arise. Seeing the desperation of their situation, We will want them to be freed of this pain and achieve lasting happiness. We will want to do whatever we can to bring that about. This then leads us to see that to be a skilled guide, I have to become a Buddha jewel through cultivation of the Dharma jewel and be able to guide them as an actual Sangha jewel. And this leads to the generation of the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility, where we take it as our responsibility to guide each and every being to the attainment of their own liberation. And in addition to that mind, to do this, we will strive to become a Buddha, the second mind. With these two, we have generated bodhicitta. So this afternoon then, we'll start to look at the stages of training of a practitioner of greatest capacity, a practitioner that is a bodhisattva.